Our second reading is found in the Gospel according to Luke, chapter number 13, and beginning with verse number 10. Before I read, thank all the folks that have provided music this morning and our puppets. My day is making more sense now because when I sat down in my office this morning and doing some last-minute preparation for the worship service, I heard sounds that sounded like sheep and wolves coming from the room next door, and now I understand why. So makes more sense. Thank you all. Our gospel lesson. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and just then appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, angry because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days to be cured and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites, does not each one of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. May God bless the reading and the hearing of this word. May we hear in it a word that is to us and for us. In the course of announcements, I meant to thank Chris Stevenson for arranging our trip to the mosque in Rayford, and to thank everybody that went. We had an incredibly meaningful experience there with that group of fine people. I will tell you a story that I just feel a need to get off my chest. That morning when I woke up, Friday morning, I was getting dressed and I went into my sock drawer and pulled out a black sock. And I went in to get a matching sock, and I reached in and pulled one out, and it didn't match. And I reached in to pull another one out. They were black, but the toes didn't match, and it just looked very different. Anyway, I got frustrated and impatient, and pulled out another one. It didn't match, but it was black. So I said, "Who's gonna know, right?" Well, when I arrived at the mosque, as tradition stands there, we take our shoes off before entering, and when I took my shoes off and looked down, I said, "Well, there's the answer to that question about who's going to know." Pretty much everybody. But anyway, John Arnold was the first one to notice. "John, I want you to know my socks match today, so that I don't want you to be distracted by anything like that." In his book, A New Christianity for a New World, John Shelby Spong tells a story about a young woman named Katie Ford. Her story is worth telling again, I think. Katie was pursuing her Master of Divinity at Harvard University. And despite her interest in ordained ministry, she wasn't sure if she was going to stay on that path. She was alienated from her home church because they discouraged not only her, but any woman from vocational ministry, particularly the kind that would put them behind a pulpit. In fact, she had become uncertain if she could continue to stay in church at all. You see, it wasn't the living God with whom she was at odds. It was the God she saw expressed in many of the creeds of her church. These are her words. "The Father, Almighty God, embodied in the creeds, is a deity who chooses some of the world's children while rejecting others. He is the Father who needs a blood sacrifice, the Father of wrath, the Father of patriarchal marriage, the Father of male ordination and female submission, the Father of heterosexual privilege, the Father of literal and spiritual slavery." It is important to understand that Katie Ford longed for a home in the church. She was highly gifted, and she longed to use those gifts in the service of the church. but she wasn't sure she could stay. And in a sermon that she preached before her seminary class, she expressed her struggle by painting an imaginary picture of a small town that was facing a flood. These are her words again. The rains fell relentlessly over a period of days, and the river rose dangerously. The people formed sandbag bridges, but they couldn't raise them fast enough to deal with the rising waters of the flood. Soon the waters covered their fields and drowned their crops. The people taking shelter in their homes watched helplessly as their livelihoods floated away. They wanted to flee for their lives, but were so totally attached to the values enshrined in their farms and in that small town, they felt that they couldn't leave. But still, the river kept rising. It covered the first floor of their homes, and they again could only watch as family pictures and heirlooms, symbols of their past, were destroyed. Their homes were becoming unlivable. The groundwater was becoming contaminated by waters of the flood. They knew that if they stayed, they would die. And yet something powerful and relentless inside of them urged them to remain right where they were. Ultimately, the sermon revealed for Katie that this is what the church as she knew it had become. It was a place she loved, a place she had always called home, but it was killing her spirit. If she stayed, she feared she would die. But still, she struggled to leave. She either had to find a new way to be in church and a new way to speak of God, or lose her soul. That was her struggle. Perhaps some of you know something about that kind of struggle. Today's gospel lesson is also a story of struggle. Let us consider some of the questions that it poses to us as we gather as a faith community. First, what was it that bent this woman? I think that Luke is asking us to consider more than the medical science answers to that question. In fact, this lesson hurls one question after another at its readers. What were the forces which bent her and left her unable to stand? The text implies that it was a spiritual matter. Was it the way that people in her world saw her as a problem and not as a person? That would bend and break a person. When people looked at her with leering glances, did she feel the weight of their prejudice on her back because they saw only her limitations and not her potential? That would bend and break a person. I've shared the struggle of Katie Ford this morning because it guides us to one of the key questions of the text. What about the religious community? What was their place in her life? Would they increase her suffering, or would they become an instrument of her liberation? Now, there's a nuance in this passage that I want us to capture this morning. It's always been there, but I only noticed it recently, and that is that Jesus does a strange thing. But Jesus sometimes did strange things. Luke goes to a lot of trouble to highlight the reality of this woman's situation. He gives us 3 pieces of information to accentuate and drive home the point. He says, first of all, that she'd been crippled for 18 years. This conveys the seriousness of her condition and the length of her suffering. But it also tells us that she had not always been that way. She could remember a time when she was whole. In the second place, we are told that she is bent over. In fact, the original language suggests that she was almost bent in half. Thirdly, we are informed that she is quite unable to stand up. Luke seems intent on driving home this point, the depth and the extent of her suffering. This leads us to Jesus' seemingly strange behavior. Jesus, we are informed, sees her. Now, I want to share a number with you, 138. And you can use this number to impress your friends at dinner some night regarding the trivial information that you know. 138 times in the Gospels we are informed, and maybe this isn't so trivial, that Jesus saw. He saw a person or he saw a crowd. And when he saw those people, when he saw those crowds, and when he saw someone suffering, he reacted. He did something. We are told that he saw her. He noticed her. You see, she was used to troubled glances and stares, but she was not used to really being seen. Having seen her, wouldn't you think, based on Luke's description, that Jesus would go over to her if he hoped to help her? Wouldn't good manners suggest this? This woman Luke so graphically describes as disabled, but he doesn't go to her. He calls her over. He calls her to stand up and to walk to him. Jesus calls this woman who is seemingly barely able to move to come forward toward him, and by the time that she gets to him, he speaks to her as if she had already been healed. A commentator and blogger named Alice McKenzie puts the crux of the text this way. She says the exact thing that she cannot do and yearns to do is precisely the thing Jesus empowers her to do. As I've shared with you before, I am fond of the phrase, the church being the church. And we may have many different ideas of what it looks like when the church is being the church, but it is safe to say this. The church is being the church when it begins to convince people of what they can do instead of what they cannot do. The church is being the church when it begins to help formulate a vision in people's minds of what liberation for everyone looks like, instead of leaning on the reasons why folk ought to remain in bondage so as not to cause the status quo a disturbance or discomfort. The church is being the church when it emboldens its people to claim their place at the table, and not when it sells anyone a bill of goods about why they should remain second-class citizens at that table. When the church is being the church, it emboldens. When the church is being the church, it empowers. When the church is being the church, it encourages. When the church is being the church, it makes people brave. When the church is being the church, it leaves broken chains all in its wake. Aviva Gottlieb Zonberg makes a provocative suggestion in a book titled The Particulars of the Rapture. She speaks of the absence in many places in Scripture of women in the story. And these are her words. The relative absence of women, relative that is to men, from the entirety of the biblical narrative is striking. That after a woman gave birth to the Abrahamic dynasty in Genesis, they almost completely disappear. She claims, however, that they continue to exist in the biblical narrative in what she calls a repressed fashion. She says it is important to pay attention to the ways women appear in the biblical narrative. What that might lead us to ask in stories which have women in them is, what is being repressed in this story? In this story, what might have been repressed had Jesus allowed it to be repressed, and had he not so intentionally brought it to the surface, is the role that religious forces played in the wounding of this woman, but also the role that they could possibly play in her liberation. 3 times in Luke's gospel, Jesus heals on the Sabbath. And every time he does it in the very light of day. There's no effort being made to conceal these breaches of Sabbath law, which were serious business in his world. Every time he does so, he does it in front of religious leaders. It is as if he is intentionally drawing them into dialogue. He is intentionally drawing them into conversation. We must always enter such a moment with a reminder to avoid the anti-Semitic slant, which would suggest that every Jew practiced a burdensome form of faith and that every religious leader was an enemy of Jesus, because those things are just not true. Far from passing judgment on the nature of their faith, which was also his faith, he envisions it living out of its highest ideals. Jesus performs these Sabbath healings in order to enter into a conversation regarding what religion is and what it can be. He enters a conversation with religious leaders regarding the dangers of an oppressive faith, and at the same time, he reveals the possibilities which exist for religion to be an instrument of liberation. Commentators will charge us to take note of the fact that Jesus doesn't call this event a miracle. It's someone else. It's one of those religious leaders who labels it a miracle. And what may be important about that is this: Jesus doesn't call it a miracle because in his mind and in his soul and in his vision, this is simply the faith community being the faith community. We might say today that it is indeed the church being the church when people enter the community bent and leave the community having been made whole, having been made able to do the very things that they longed to do but could not. Call it a miracle if you want, but in Jesus' mind, this may simply be the church being the church and doing what it is meant to do. In this remarkable story, Jesus not only emboldens the woman, that is important, but he is attempting to embolden the faith community to live out of its highest ideals. As much as the gift of healing and empowerment is for the woman, the witness that it provides is for the faith community, for us. Although she isn't named, we should take note sometime to note who this woman is. She is everyone who has ever struggled to rise above low self-worth and judgment from others. She is everyone who has struggled with illness and the way illness shapes the way people see the ill. She is everyone who has carried the soul-crushing weight of feeling unvalued. She is everyone who's ever felt the burden of grief and to know the way it can bend the mind and body and spirit. She is everyone who, like Katie Ford, has lived in a situation that is unbearable and intolerable. She is everyone who has been told you can't and believed it. She is everyone who has been told you aren't enough and believed it. She is everyone who's been told you don't belong here and believed it. She is everyone and anyone who has lost hope and no longer knows where to go to find it. This great gospel text, however, isn't just a reminder that human beings can become broken by life's weight. Jesus makes sure that it is instead held up as a reminder of who and what a faith community can be. From time to time, we need to recommit this space to its purpose, to what it is meant to be, to the liberating and life-giving spirit which we hope to pervade this place. Around the turn of the century, I was pastoring a church that existed right across the road from another United Church of Christ congregation, an African American congregation. We had discovered a number of ways during my years there to partner with that church. We had services together. We did pulpit swaps together. We had meals together. And we, especially on our side of the road, well, we were kind of proud of all these efforts. One thing we hadn't done, however, was we had not talked about our history and how long we had existed there together. A history that went all the way back to the times when slaves worshiped in the balcony of the white congregation. We had not gone back and talked about the subsequent decades which passed one after the other without anybody crossing that road to build relationships. We were also proud of our efforts, both churches really, that we invited the United Church of Christ newspaper. They used to have an actual newspaper, made out of paper that went out. And they sent a reporter down to cover our feel-good story. The reporter's name was Jimmy Israel. And to our surprise, he wasn't interested in our feel-good story. But he believed from his reporter's mind that the real story was about the things we hadn't talked about. In retrospect, he was absolutely as right on as he could be. But at the time, there was tension there because he wanted to write one story, and we wanted to see ourselves in another story. After a weekend, he spent time in worship services of both churches, and we had a final conversation before taking him back to the airport. What I haven't forgotten about that conversation from 20 years ago is the moment when he walked over and he patted with his hands on the bricks of the church. And he put his foot down on the ground and he said, the blood of slaves is in these bricks and it's on this ground. And the two congregations will never be fully okay until you talk about it. Well, among other things, this served to teach me that the spirits which are invited into a place linger in that, and perhaps they even sink into the bricks of the mortar. When healing occurs and hopes are lifted, it seeps into the pores of the space. When people are emboldened to demand dignity for themselves and dignity for everyone else, the energy expands into the nooks and the crannies of the space. The gospel passage today is meant not only to cause us to marvel at the healing, but is meant to spark our spiritual imaginations regarding what we can be as a faith community and what sort of spirit this place can hold in its walls. And so, we are left to pledge and to pray. We pledge to sustain, support, and encourage and love one another. We pledge in this space to choose courage over complicity when facing the injustices of the world. We pledge within these walls to choose action over inertia as we accept our calling to be God's people in this corner of the world. We understand our faith community. I think we do. In fact, I know we do, to be something born of God. And so we lift this prayer that God who brought us to life, that this place would be the workshop of our finest endeavors, the cradle of our highest hopes, and the birthplace of our most noble dreams. Let it be. Let it be. Let it be. Amen.